The alien princess lay bleeding out in the rubble, not a single alien lifting a finger to help her, until the human soldier arrived. Plasma bolts sizzled past Wayne Young's ear, barely missing his head as he ducked behind the blasted remains of a hover transport. The human soldier checked his rifle's ammo count, only half a clip left. Fuck! His combat armor sparked. The backplating melted clean through from an earlier plasma volley that left his skin blistered and bleeding. Wayne knew his odds. Maybe 2 minutes until the enemy platoon stormed his position and turned him to ash, but then a high-pitched wail cut through the gunfire, coming from a collapsed structure nearby. He glanced over and glimpsed blood-stained, ornate cloth peeking out from under the rubble. No way. Wayne rushed over, heaving up the heavy slabs of concrete. There lay Zephyr, the wounded Breen princess, her royal garments shredded and soaked crimson. He froze in shock. The Breen were humanity's sworn enemies in this war. Protocol dictated one course of action: leave her to die. The Breen never took human prisoners alive. But she was a civilian. No weapons, no combat implants. Just an innocent girl, no older than Wayne's kid sister back on Earth. Saving Zephyr would mean abandoning his squad, his mission, betraying his entire race. The Alliance would brand him a traitor and a coward. But as he stared down at her broken body, watching her life slowly ebb away, Wayne faced a choice that would damn him either way, and time was running out. Wayne couldn't leave her like this. Protocol be damned. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and scooped Zephyr up in his arms, cradling her close to his chest. His muscles screamed in protest, his burned skin stretched and cracked, but he pushed through the pain. He took off running through the war-ravaged streets, zigging and zagging to avoid the plasma bolts whizzing past them. His heart raced as he leaped over piles of smoking rubble, each impact jolting through his battered body. Zephyr's blood soaked into his fatigues, her breaths growing fainter against his neck. Wayne's legs burned with every stride, his lungs heaving for air. The edges of his vision blurred, exhaustion and pain threatening to overwhelm him. But he couldn't stop. He had to find safety, shelter, somewhere to hide before the enemy found them. The seconds stretched into eternity, death closing in with every heartbeat. Then, through the haze of smoke, Wayne spotted a half-collapsed building, a dark gap yawning beneath the crumbled walls, a bomb shelter. Hope surged through him, and he put on a final burst of speed, charging toward salvation. Wayne kicked down the warped door, metal screeching in protest. He stumbled inside, quickly laying Zephyr on the dusty floor before turning back to the entrance. With the last of his fading strength, Wayne heaved broken beams and chunks of concrete in front of the opening, creating a makeshift barricade. The shelter was pitch black, the only light filtering through gaps in the debris. Wayne fumbled for his flashlight and flicked it on, the weak beam cutting through the darkness. In the dim glow, he knelt beside Zephyr and ripped open his meager first aid kit. She was so pale, her vibrant skin now ashen. Wayne's shaking hands pressed bandages against her wounds, trying to stem the crimson flow. Zephyr's eyes fluttered open, hazy and unfocused. Her gaze met Wayne's and something passed between them. An understanding, a connection. The lines of war blurred. Then the sound of boots pounding over rubble shattered the spell, voices barking orders just outside. The enemy searching for survivors. Zephyr let out a soft cry of pain and fear. Wayne quickly covered her mouth with his hand, his own breath frozen in his chest. He held Zephyr close as the footsteps thudded past, mere inches from their hiding place. Sweat trickled down Wayne's back as the seconds crawled by. Finally, the patrol moved on, the sounds fading into the distance. Wayne exhaled shakily and looked down at Zephyr, his hand still clamped over her mouth. He'd bought them time, but now what? They were trapped in a crumbling hole while war raged outside, his ammo nearly gone, his body battered, and the enemy scouring the city. He'd escaped a quick death on the battlefield, but now they faced the specter of a slow, agonizing end in the dark. The weight of his choice crashed over Wayne as he held Zephyr, the future suddenly as bleak as the shadows engulfing them. As the thud of enemy boots receded into the distance, Wayne slowly eased his hand off of Zephyr's mouth. In the tense stillness that enveloped the bomb shelter, the two began to communicate through a halting combination of gestures and broken phrases in each other's tongues. Zephyr's shaky hand movements and Wayne's clumsy attempts at the Breen language gradually painted a picture far different from what he had assumed. It became clear that Zephyr hadn't just been a helpless victim caught in the crossfire. She had been fleeing from her own kind when the attack hit. Through their stilted exchange, a stunning truth emerged. Zephyr wasn't merely a princess. She was the linchpin in a potential peace accord between humanity and the Breen. Factions on both sides, even Zephyr's own father, the Breen Emperor himself, vehemently opposed any truce. They were determined to keep the war raging at all costs. It seemed Zephyr had been heading to a clandestine meeting with human diplomats when her convoy was ambushed. The implications crashed over Wayne like a tidal wave. The young soldier now cradled in his arms not just a life, but the potential key to ending the bloodshed that had consumed both their species for so long. As the weight of this revelation sank in, Wayne took a closer look at Zephyr's injuries. His heart dropped into his stomach. She was in far worse shape than he had initially realized, without real medical treatment, and soon she would undoubtedly slip away. An impossible dilemma loomed before Wayne. Venturing out of their fragile sanctuary to seek aid would mean braving the deadly labyrinth of the war-torn city. But remaining here, helplessly watching Zephyr fade, was its own kind of hell. The narrator invites us into the agonizing tumult of Wayne's mind as he grappled with this impossible choice. There were no good options, and time was swiftly running out. Just as despair began to sink its claws into Wayne, a crackling sound cut through the suffocating silence of the shelter. Wayne's radio had come alive with a transmission from his squad. They were pulling back from the area and would be passing close by the shelter's location in mere minutes. A tiny ember of hope flared in Wayne's chest. If he could somehow signal his unit without drawing the attention of the enemy troops still scouring the area, they just might be able to extract him and Zephyr. She could get the medical care she so urgently needed. The narrator draws us into the razor's edge upon which Wayne finds himself balanced. The risk of revealing their position to the enemy weighs like an anvil in one hand, the chance to save Zephyr resting like a fragile soap bubble in the other. The shelter suddenly feels at once claustrophobic and achingly exposed as the clock ticks on. Wayne closes his eyes for a long moment, his jaw tightening. Zephyr's breath is so faint against his chest. He looks down at her still face, something hardening behind his eyes. He knows what he has to do. For her, for their people, for a chance to stop the cycle of blood and loss. Wayne reaches for his radio, decision made, and prepares to make the most important call of his life. Wayne took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. Time was of the essence now. He carefully gathered Zephyr in his arms once more, her weight seeming to have doubled since their desperate flight began. With a grunt of effort, he heaved them both to their feet and staggered to the shelter's entrance. The thick metal door loomed before him, both a protective barrier and a daunting obstacle. Wayne set Zephyr down gently, propping her against the wall. He had to be sure the way was clear. The soldier pressed his eye to a crack in the barricade, peering out into the war-ravaged cityscape. Smoke curled in lazy tendrils from scorched buildings, rubble lay strewn across the streets. An eerie silence hung over everything, thick and oppressive. But silence, Wayne knew all too well, could be deceptive. Danger often lurked just beneath its placid surface. Still, he saw no immediate signs of the enemy. No flashes of movement, no glint of weapons. It was as clear as it was going to get. Wayne's heart hammered against his ribs as he eased the door open, the rusted hinges screeching in protest. He winced at the noise, but there was no help for it. Scooping Zephyr back into his arms, he stepped out into the open, half expecting a hail of plasma fire to cut them down at any moment. The narrator lays out the gauntlet before Wayne in vivid detail. The once thriving city had been reduced to a nightmarish labyrinth of collapsed buildings and debris-choked streets. Every shadowed doorway and pile of rubble could conceal an enemy lying in wait. Every step was a gamble with death. Calling on his last dregs of strength, Wayne pushed himself harder, weaving and zigzagging to make himself a more difficult target. All the while, He broadcast an urgent stream of coordinates and landmarks to his unit over the radio, praying they would reach him in time. The toll of Wayne's battered body was a palpable thing, a leaden weight threatening to drag him down with every stride. His muscles screamed in agony, his lungs seared with every breath. The pain of his wounds had faded to a distant throb, drowned out by the all-consuming need to push forward. For Zephyr, for the chance of peace. Just as that thought crossed Wayne's mind, the crack of a rifle shattered the tense quiet. The narrator immerses us in the visceral shock of the moment. Fiery agony exploded through Wayne's thigh, his leg buckling beneath him. He hit the ground hard, barely managing to twist his body to shield Zephyr from the impact. Gravel bit into his palms and knees, the coppery tang of blood blooming in his mouth. But Wayne was no stranger to pain. Gritting his teeth, he hauled himself back to his feet, ignoring the warm wetness spreading down his leg. He couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Not with Zephyr's life hanging in the balance. The enemy had found them. Wayne could hear their shouts echoing off the crumbling walls, growing louder with each passing second. They were closing in, drawn by the sound of the gunshot and the scent of fresh blood. His radio crackled to life, his commander's voice tense but determined. "We're almost there, Wayne, just a little further. Don't you dare give up now, soldier." Those words were like a jolt of electricity, spurring Wayne forward. He ran like a man possessed, his world narrowed to the uneven rhythm of his footsteps and the precious weight in his arms. The enemy's shouts grew to a fever pitch behind him, mingling with the roar of blood in his ears. Just as their pursuers seemed poised to overtake them, a series of deafening explosions ripped through the air. The ground heaved beneath Wayne's feet, nearly sending him sprawling. The acrid stench of smoke and burnt metal flooded his nostrils. Relief crashed over Wayne in a dizzying wave. His unit had arrived, raining down covering fire on the enemy soldiers. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe they might make it out of this hellscape alive. That fragile hope shattered as Wayne rounded a corner and found himself face to face with a Breen soldier. The alien's rifle snapped up, aimed squarely at Wayne's chest. The human's arms tightened instinctively around Zephyr, his own weapon hopelessly out of reach. But then something unexpected happened. The soldier hesitated, his finger hovering over the trigger as his gaze fell on the injured princess in Wayne's arms. In that split second of indecision, Wayne made a choice that would reverberate through the ages. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered Zephyr to the ground, never breaking eye contact with the Breen soldier. Then he straightened and raised his hands, palms out, a gesture of surrender, of truce. In that moment, the narrator reflects, two enemies saw each other's humanity for perhaps the first time. The Breen soldier, his weapon still raised, stared at Wayne for a long, tense moment. Then, incredibly, he lowered his rifle. Wordlessly, the two soldiers bent and carefully lifted Zephyr between them. United by a higher purpose, they carried her through the shattered city streets towards the waiting rescue of Wayne's unit. An impossible ceasefire, born in the heart of battle, a glimmer of hope amid the destruction that even the deepest scars of war might one day heal. The narrator takes us to the pivotal moment as Wayne and the Breen soldier approach the human unit's position, Zephyr cradled between them. The air crackles with tension, the human soldier's weapons snapping up in confused alarm at the sight of their comrades side by side with an enemy. "Wayne, what the hell are you doing?" his commander barks, rifle trained on the Breen soldier. "Step away from the hostile now." But Wayne stands his ground, meeting his commander's gaze unflinchingly. "Sir, this is Princess Zephyr of the Breen. She holds the key to ending this war." The commander's brow furrows, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Have you lost your mind, soldier? That's an enemy combatant." Wayne shakes his head, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "No, sir, not anymore. Zephyr was on her way to negotiate a peace treaty when she was attacked, by her own people." The narrator highlights the incredible risk Wayne is taking in this moment, defying direct orders and placing his trust in a sworn enemy. The fate of two races hangs in the balance. The commander hesitates, a battle raging behind his eyes, duty wars with the chance for a diplomatic breakthrough. The other soldiers shift uneasily, their weapons still raised. Just as the situation threatens to boil over, Zephyr stirs in Wayne's arms. Her eyes flutter open, her voice weak, but filled with quiet authority. He speaks the truth. I am Princess Zephyr, and I seek an end to this conflict. Please let me pass. Let me bring peace to our peoples. A stunned silence falls over the assembled soldiers. The narrator imparts the gravity of this moment, as the weight of Zephyr's words settles over them. Slowly, cautiously, the human soldiers lower their weapons. The Breen soldier, too, steps back, his hands raised in a gesture of non-aggression. In this fragile, unexpected truce, a flicker of hope takes root. The commander lowers his rifle, reaching for his comm unit. "Command, this is Alpha Leader. We have a situation here, requesting immediate extraction for an injured Breen VIP and one of our own. Diplomatic urgency, over." As they wait for a response, the Breen soldier speaks up, his voice gruff but resolute. "I will go with them. I, too, believe in the possibility of peace. I will do what I can to help make it a reality." The narrator reflects on the immense courage of this declaration. In choosing to accompany Zephyr and Wayne, the Breen soldier is effectively turning his back on his own kind, risking everything for the chance of a better future. Command's response crackles over the comm, ordering an immediate extraction to the nearest human base for debriefing and medical treatment. As the transport ship touches down and the unlikely trio board, the narrator leaves us with a powerful image: a human soldier, an alien princess, and a Breen defector, united by a shared purpose. The road ahead is uncertain, fraught with challenges and opposition from those who profit from the war's continuation. But in this moment, as the ship lifts off into the smoke-filled sky, there is hope. Hope that the cycle of violence can be broken, hope that two species, locked in a bitter struggle for survival, might finally find a path to peace. The transport ship streaked through the smoke-choked sky, a gleaming sliver of hope amid the chaos of war. Inside its battered hull, an unlikely trio found themselves united by the threads of fate: Wayne, the human soldier; Zephyr, the Breen princess; and Talon, the alien warrior who had defected from his own kind. The atmosphere on board crackled with tension, as the human soldiers eyed Talon warily, their fingers never straying far from their weapons. Trust was a fragile thing, hard-won and easily shattered, especially between enemies with so much blood spilled between them. But Wayne remained steadfast by Zephyr's side, his attention focused on her labored breathing and the pallor of her skin beneath the vivid alien markings. He adjusted the makeshift bandages, murmuring reassurances in a voice roughened by exhaustion and smoke. There was a tenderness in his actions that transcended the boundaries of species and allegiance. As the base grew larger on the horizon, a flicker of hope kindled in Wayne's chest. Safety was tantalizingly close, a promise of medical aid for Zephyr, and a chance to broker the peace she so desperately sought. But that hope was shattered in an instant, as a brilliant flash lit up the sky and the ship lurched violently. Alarms blared, the cacophony of screeching metal and shouting voices filling the air. Acrid smoke billowed from the rear of the ship, the deck pitching beneath their feet. The narrator's voice rises above the din, urgent and grim. Breen loyalists, enraged by Zephyr's betrayal and Talon's desertion, had launched a desperate attack to prevent them from reaching human territory. The pilot wrenched at the controls, the ship groaning as it veered and jinked in a valiant attempt to evade the onslaught. But the damage was too severe, the enemy's aim too true. Consoles sparked and smoked, the lights flickering ominously as the ship began to lose altitude. In the midst of the chaos, a cold realization crystallized in Wayne's mind. They weren't going to make it to the base. The ship was coming apart around them, the ground rushing up to meet them at a terrifying speed. He acted on instinct, scooping Zephyr into his arms and staggering towards the escape pods. His muscles screamed in protest, his wounds throbbing with each jarring step, but he pushed through the pain. He had to get her to safety, no matter the cost. Talon appeared at Wayne's side, his alien features set in grim determination. He raised his weapon, providing cover fire as they navigated the treacherous gauntlet of twisted metal and sparking wires. The ship bucked and shuddered, the enemy's fire ripping through its hull with relentless fury. The narrator paints a vivid picture of the desperate race against time, the trio's progress marked by the trail of blood and sweat in their wake. Wayne's world narrowed to the pod ahead, to the precious cargo in his arms, and the alien ally guarding his back. With a final burst of effort, they reached the escape pod. Wayne stumbled inside, his arms trembling as he lowered Zephyr onto the seat with infinite care. He turned to help Talon, but a sudden explosion rocked the ship, throwing him backwards. The breath rushed from his lungs as he hit the deck, stars dancing across his vision. Strong hands gripped Wayne's arms, hauling him upright. Talon's face swam into focus, a grim understanding etched in the alien lines of his features. The pod was meant for two, and Zephyr's unconscious form already occupied one of the seats. Time seemed to slow as realization dawned, a heavy weight settling in Wayne's chest. Talon met his gaze steadily, a hint of sorrow and fierce resolve mingling in his eyes. Before Wayne could react, Talon shoved him backwards into the pod, sealing the door with a resounding clang. Wayne surged forward, his fists pounding against the reinforced glass. He shouted until his throat was raw, pleading with Talon to open the door, to not sacrifice himself. But the alien warrior merely smiled, a strange serenity settling over his features as he reached for the eject button. The pod jolted free of the ship with a bone-jarring lurch, the sudden silence deafening in the confines of the small space. Wayne pressed his hands against the window, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the transport ship recede, Talon's form a tiny silhouette against the flames. Then, with a blinding flash and a soundless roar, the ship exploded. Wayne recoiled as if physically struck, a wordless cry tearing from his throat. The fireball consumed everything, a ravenous beast devouring metal and flesh alike. The narrator's voice is heavy with emotion as the pod hurtles through the atmosphere, buffeted by the winds of war and sacrifice. Wayne tore his gaze away from the fading inferno, his attention focusing on Zephyr's still form. He would protect Zephyr, would fight for the peace she envisioned with every fiber of his being. For Talon's sacrifice, for the lives lost on both sides of this bloody conflict, he would see this through to the end. The escape pod hurtled through the atmosphere, a fiery comet streaking across the darkening sky. Inside, Wayne braced himself for impact, one arm wrapped protectively around Zephyr's unconscious form. The ground rushed up to meet them, an endless expanse of dense forest stretching out in every direction. The pod slammed into the earth with a deafening crunch of metal and shattering glass. The force of the impact jolted through Wayne's battered body, ripping a grunt of pain from his throat. For a long moment, he lay there, dazed and disoriented, the world spinning madly around him. But there was no time to waste. Wayne shook his head to clear it, wincing as the motion sent a fresh wave of agony washing over him. He reached out, his fingers fumbling for the release mechanism on the pod's crumpled door. With a hiss of hydraulics and a groan of protesting metal, the door swung open, letting in a rush of cool, damp air. Wayne hauled himself out of the wreckage, every muscle screaming in protest. He turned back, reaching in to carefully gather Zephyr into his arms. She was limp and unresponsive, her skin ashen beneath the vivid alien markings, but she was still breathing, the rise and fall of her chest a small miracle in itself. The narrator reflects on the weight of responsibility that settled onto Wayne's shoulders in that moment. Zephyr's life, and with it, the fragile hope for peace between their people, rested quite literally in his hands. He couldn't afford to fail, not now, not after everything they'd been through. With a grunt of effort, Wayne hoisted Zephyr over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. His legs trembled under the added weight, threatening to buckle, but he gritted his teeth and pushed onward. He staggered away from the smoking ruin of the escape pod, disappearing into the dark maze of trees that loomed ahead. As he walked, the narrator gives voice to the thoughts tumbling through Wayne's mind. Grief, sharp and raw, for the loss of Talon and the other soldiers who had given their lives to protect them. Worry, gnawing and relentless, for Zephyr's deteriorating condition. and beneath it all a grim determination to see their mission through no matter the cost. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees pressing in from all sides like silent sentinels. The undergrowth tugged at Wayne's boots, threatening to trip him with every step. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes and plastering his hair to his forehead. But he pushed on, driven by sheer force of will. Hours crawled by, the sun sinking ever lower in the sky. Exhaustion weighed heavily on Wayne, turning his limbs to lead and fogging his mind. Just as he was about to collapse, his legs giving out beneath him, he spotted it. A dark gap in the wall of foliage ahead, the mouth of a cave yawning open like a promise of salvation. Relief surged through Wayne, lending new strength to his aching muscles. He staggered forward, half stumbling, half falling into the cool dimness of the cave. The damp stone felt blessedly solid beneath his feet after the treacherous shifting ground of the forest floor. Wayne carried Zephyr deeper into the cave, laying her down with infinite gentleness on a bed of soft moss. She looked so small, so vulnerable, her royal finery torn and stained with blood and dirt. The sight tore at Wayne's heart, stoking the embers of his resolve. Using the survival skills drilled into him during his training, Wayne set about making them as safe and comfortable as possible. He gathered dry wood from the cave's depths and coaxed a small fire to life, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the rocky walls. Next, he turned his attention to Zephyr's wounds. Using the meager medical supplies he'd managed to salvage from the escape pod, Wayne cleaned and dressed her injuries as best he could. It wasn't much, but it would have to do until they could get proper help. As he worked, the narrator notes the tenderness in Wayne's touch, the gentle way he handled Zephyr's battered body. It was a stark contrast to the violence and brutality that had defined their lives for so long, a glimpse of the humanity that still endured beneath the soldier's hardened exterior. Suddenly Zephyr stirred, a faint moan escaping her lips. Wayne froze, hardly daring to breathe. Slowly her eyes fluttered open, hazy and unfocused at first, then sharpening as they locked onto Wayne's face. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice hoarse and barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "Thank you." Wayne swallowed hard, a lump rising in his throat. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he simply nodded, hoping that the depth of his emotion, the sheer relief at seeing her awake, would be evident in his eyes. But the moment was shattered by a sound that sent ice water coursing through Wayne's veins, the unmistakable echo of footsteps coming from the cave's entrance. In an instant, he was on his feet, weapon in hand, positioning himself between Zephyr and the potential threat. The narrator ratchets up the tension as the footsteps grew louder, closer. Wayne's finger tightened on the trigger, his heart pounding in his ears. A figure emerged from the shadows, and Wayne braced himself for the worst. But then the impossible happened. The figure stepped into the firelight, and Wayne found himself face to face with Talon. The Breen soldier was bloodied and bruised, his armor scorched and dented, but he was very much alive. Shock rooted Wayne to the spot, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Talon, sensing his confusion, quickly explained how he had managed to escape the doomed transport ship in a second pod, tracking Wayne and Zephyr's landing site with the determination to continue their mission together. As the initial surprise wore off, Wayne felt a surge of joy, of gratitude, of sheer relief. He lowered his weapon and stepped forward, clasping Talon's forearm in a warrior's greeting. In that moment, the narrator reflects, the bond between these three unlikely allies was forged anew, tempered in the fires of shared adversity and sacrifice. Together they huddled around the flickering campfire, tending to each other's wounds, and beginning to plan their next move. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and opposition from all sides. But in that small, sheltered space, in the company of those who understood the true cost of war, Wayne felt a glimmer of hope rekindled in his chest. Perhaps, just perhaps, they could see this through. Perhaps the dream of peace was not so far-fetched after all. In the dim firelight of the cave, Wayne, Zephyr, and Talon huddled together, their faces etched with determination and exhaustion. The narrator invites us into their war council, as they pore over crude maps of the terrain, discussing the safest route to the distant peace summit. Zephyr's voice is quiet but unwavering as she outlines the challenges ahead. "The journey will be perilous," she says, tracing a finger along the map. "We must navigate through enemy-held territory, avoiding patrols from both my people and yours. But we must reach the summit. Too much depends on it." Wayne and Talon nod grimly, the weight of their mission settling heavily on their shoulders. As they prepare to set out at first light, Zephyr hesitates, a shadow crossing her face. "There's something you both need to know," she says softly. "The attack on my convoy. It wasn't just the work of Breen loyalists. There were humans involved as well. Factions within your own military." The narrator lets this revelation hang in the air, heavy and cold. Wayne and Talon exchange a shocked glance, the implications sinking in. "There are those on both sides who profit from this war," the narrator explains. "Powerful individuals who will stop at nothing to see the conflict continue, no matter the cost in blood." The betrayal stings, but it only hardens the resolve of the unlikely trio. They understand now more than ever the importance of their mission. As dawn breaks over the mouth of the cave, they set out, Wayne and Talon taking turns supporting Zephyr, whose injuries still pain her. The narrator paints a vivid picture of their arduous trek through the wilderness. They pick their way through dense forests and over rocky ridges, always alert for any sign of enemy activity. They skirt the edges of battlefields still smouldering from recent clashes, the acrid stench of smoke and death thick in the air. Days bleed into weeks, and the toll of the journey begins to show. They grow leaner, harder, their faces gaunt and their eyes haunted. They subsist on whatever meager rations they can forage, always careful to leave no trace of their passing. One night, as they make camp in the hollow of a giant gnarled tree, Zephyr's strength finally gives out. She collapses, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her skin burning with fever. Wayne kneels beside her, his heart clenching with fear, as he realizes the severity of her condition. "She needs real medical attention," he says to Talon, his voice raw with desperation. "Medicine, proper facilities. She won't make it much further like this." Talon is silent for a long moment, his alien features inscrutable in the moonlight. Then slowly an idea begins to take shape. "There's a Breen medical outpost not far from here," he says. "If we could infiltrate it, disguise Zephyr as one of our own." Wayne catches on immediately, his mind racing ahead. It's a dangerous gamble, but what choice do they have? They spend the rest of the night planning, going over every detail, every contingency. As the first rays of sun peek through the canopy, Wayne and Talon are ready. Clad in stolen Breen uniforms, they approach the outpost, Zephyr laid out on a stretcher between them. The narrator captures the tension of the moment as Wayne fights to keep his face impassive, his heart pounding against his ribs. The Breen guards at the gate eye them suspiciously, but the sight of a wounded soldier is hardly unusual in these times. They wave the trio through, and Wayne has to stop himself from sighing in relief. Inside the outpost is a hive of activity. Breen soldiers and medics rush to and fro, the air thick with the coppery scent of blood and the sharp tang of antiseptic. Wayne and Talon keep their heads down, navigating the unfamiliar corridors, following the signs to the medical bay. As the medics work, Wayne and Talon stand guard, their hands never straying far from their concealed weapons. Each second feels like an eternity, the risk of discovery growing with every passing moment. And then the unthinkable happens. Alarms blare to life throughout the outpost, a cacophony of sound and flashing lights. Over the intercom, a voice crackles, "Intruders in the medical bay! All units, respond!" The narrator leaves us on the edge of our seats, as Wayne and Talon exchange a look of pure dread. The race against time has just become a desperate fight for survival. As the alarms blared through the Breen medical outpost, Wayne and Talon sprang into action. Breen soldiers burst through the doors of the medical bay, plasma rifles raised and ready to fire. In a split second, Wayne and Talon made the heart-wrenching decision to open fire on their own people, all to protect the unconscious Zephyr lying vulnerable on the treatment table. The narrator paints a vivid picture of the chaos that erupts in the medical bay. The acrid scent of plasma discharge fills the air, mingling with the coppery tang of blood. Screams of pain and fury echo off the sterile walls as Breen soldiers fall, caught off guard by the sudden betrayal of two of their own. In the confusion, Wayne and Talon seize the opportunity to barricade themselves in a nearby supply room. They overturn shelves and cabinets, forming a makeshift barrier against the onslaught of their former comrades. The pounding on the door is relentless, a thunderous rhythm of desperation and rage. "That won't hold them for long," Talon says grimly, his eyes darting around the cramped space. He kneels beside Zephyr, checking her vitals with gentle, efficient movements. "The treatment worked. She's stable, but we need to move her somewhere safe." Wayne nods, his jaw clenched tight. He scans the room, searching for anything that could aid their escape. The narrator builds the tension as Wayne's gaze falls on a ventilation grate high on the wall, barely wide enough for a person to fit through. It's a desperate gamble, but it's their only chance. Talon looks up, his expression grim. "It'll be tight, and we don't know where it leads." "We don't have a choice," Wayne replies, already moving to pry the grate open. The metal is cold and unyielding under his fingers, but he wrenches it free with a grunt of effort. Together they hoist Zephyr's limp form into the ventilation shaft. Wayne crawls in after her, his broad shoulders scraping against the sides of the narrow passage. Talon follows close behind, replacing the grate just as the door to the supply room bursts open in a shower of splintered metal and sparks. The narrator immerses us in the suffocating darkness of the ventilation system. The air is thick and stale, the only sound the rasp of their labored breathing and the distant echo of pursuing footsteps. They crawl forward, inch by painstaking inch, dragging Zephyr between them. The metal walls press in on all sides, a claustrophobic nightmare that threatens to overwhelm them at any moment. But they press on, driven by desperation and the unshakable knowledge that they are Zephyr's only hope. The minutes stretch into an eternity, the darkness broken only by the weak glow of Wayne's hand-held light. Finally, a glimmer of hope appears in the form of a distant grate, sunlight filtering through the slats. With a final burst of effort, they tumble out of the ventilation shaft and into the blinding brightness of the day. The narrator describes how they find themselves on the outskirts of the Breen outpost, the main compound a sprawling mass of buildings behind them. For a moment, they simply lie there, gulping in the fresh air and allowing the reality of their escape to sink in. But the moment is shattered by a massive explosion that rocks the ground beneath them. Wayne scrambles to his feet, his eyes widening in horror as he takes in the scene before him. The Breen outpost is engulfed in flames, the buildings crumbling under the onslaught of human artillery. The narrator reveals the terrible truth. The human forces, upon learning of Zephyr's location, have launched a full-scale assault on the outpost. Wayne, Zephyr, and Talon can only watch as the place that had offered them a fleeting moment of hope is reduced to rubble and ash. The screams of the dying echo across the distance, a terrible symphony of war's ultimate price. The narrator reflects on the heavy toll this journey has taken on each of them. The physical scars, the emotional wounds, the weight of the lives lost in pursuit of their mission. But even in the face of such devastation, a flicker of determination still burns within them. With heavy hearts, they turn their backs on the smouldering ruins of the outpost. Zephyr, now conscious but weakened, leans heavily on Wayne and Talon as they begin the long trek towards the distant peace summit. The road ahead is uncertain, fraught with untold dangers and challenges, but they carry with them the hope that their sacrifices, and the sacrifices of so many others, will not be in vain. That peace, though it comes at a terrible cost, might finally be within reach. As the trio neared the peace summit, the toll of their arduous journey was etched into their very beings. The narrator spoke of the physical wounds that marred their flesh, the scars that would serve as permanent reminders of the battles they had endured. But deeper still were the emotional scars, the invisible marks left by the loss, the betrayal, the sheer desperation of their quest. Yet beneath the weight of their shared trauma, a flicker of hope persisted. With each step, Wayne, Zephyr, and Talon dared to believe that their sacrifices, the lives lost and the blood spilled, might finally bear fruit, that the summit would mark the end of the war and the dawn of a new era of peace. But as they stepped into the summit chamber, that fragile hope was shattered like glass. The narrator's voice grew heavy with sorrow as the terrible scene was revealed. There, on the cold floor, lay the lifeless bodies of the Breen and human leaders who had called for this gathering. The very advocates for peace, struck down in a cruel twist of fate. In that moment, the truth crashed over the trio like a tidal wave. This was no peace summit. It was a trap, a ruse orchestrated by those who stood to profit from the war's continuation, a way to silence the voices of reason and ensure the conflict would rage on. Wayne felt something break inside him as the magnitude of this revelation sank in. The narrator described the utter despair that filled his heart, the sickening realization that everything they had fought for, everyone they had lost, had been for nothing. He turned to Zephyr and Talon, saw the same anguish mirrored in their eyes, the pain of betrayal, the grief of shattered dreams. But beneath that, something else flickered to life, a grim determination, a refusal to let this be the end. In that moment of shared resolve, a plan took shape. The narrator spoke of the explosives they planted around the chamber, the timer they set to ensure their own demise alongside the evidence of this terrible crime. They knew it was the only way, the only chance to expose the truth and break the cycle of war. As the timer ticked down, the three sat together, hands clasped, drawing strength from each other's presence. The narrator's voice grew soft as Wayne, Zephyr, and Talon shared their hopes for the future, their belief that their sacrifice would pave the way for true peace. The explosion, when it came, was a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the building. In the aftermath, as the smoke and dust settled, the truth began to emerge. The recordings the trio had left behind, the damning evidence they had uncovered, laid bare the corruption and lies that had perpetuated the war. The narrator spoke of the shockwaves that rippled through both societies as the extent of the deception was revealed, the outrage, the demands for accountability and change. It was a painful, messy process, but one that would ultimately lead to a true and lasting peace. In the years that followed, a memorial was erected on the site of the summit. The narrator described how it stood as a testament to the courage and sacrifice of Wayne, Zephyr, Talon, and all those who had given their lives in pursuit of a better future. Their names became synonymous with hope, with the unyielding belief that even in the darkest of times, the actions of a few could change the course of history. And so their legacy endured, a shining beacon of the indomitable spirit that resided within both humans and Breen. A reminder that peace, though often bought at a steep price, was always worth fighting for. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.